This is Counterpoint, and I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. In October 2023, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled against Ottawa and in favor of provincial autonomy. In a 5-3 decision, the Supreme Court decided that the Federal Impact Assessment Act, also known as the IAA, oversteps provincial jurisdiction and thus must stay in its lane. Of course, none is happier than the province of Alberta, which led the fight against the IAA, then called Bill 89, or Bill 69 rather, referred to as the No More Pipelines Act. But what will this decision mean for oil and gas development? Has the horse already left the stable after years of federal government stymieing pipeline development, especially in Alberta? Well, joining me now to share their reactions to this decision are Dan McTeague, president of Canadians for Affordable Energy, and Peter McCaffrey, president of the Alberta Institute. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. I suppose you're both elated with this recent Supreme Court decision. So why don't we start with you, Dan? How are you feeling in the midst of this?
Well, I think vindicated for those many who opposed this legislation, which many felt wasn't just the federal government intruding on provincial jurisdiction, but most importantly, the effect this would have on discouraging significant investments that Canada desperately needs, given that this, of course, is our single most important, resource and as well economic generator. When you consider 8 to 12% of GDP is oil and gas, the mere fact that the federal government has been rebuffed, and I should note, since again rebuffed by a federal court on the issue of the plastics ban, it would appear that it goes back to something that we'd worked at Canadians for Affordable Energy some time ago. The federal government doesn't really take into account, its obligations and its jurisdiction, much less cost-benefit analysis. Had it done so, it might have thought twice before, moving very rapidly and ignoring the good arguments that are out there about the shortcomings and the unconstitutionality of Bill C-69, which many had addressed well earlier on 2 years ago when this thing was passed.
Now, so Peter, why don't you join in and walk us through the decision here for Bill 69, again, the the Impact Assessment Act?
Well, you mentioned earlier in the introduction that the nickname for the law was the No More Pipelines law. And in some ways, that actually massively underestimated the harm of the law. That nickname made people think that it was just about some pipelines crossing the country and that Alberta wanted pipelines. It's actually really important to realize that the Impact Assessment Act was designed to allow the federal government to interfere in projects that were happening solely within a province. So nobody has any real disagreement that the federal government has a role to play on a pipeline that crosses provincial borders, or a railway or a highway or something that crosses provincial borders. Obviously, when something is crossing provincial borders, there's a role for the federal government to play. This act was designed to give the federal government control over development happening solely inside of provinces, and not just pipelines either. Roads, bridges, any large-scale infrastructure project. The federal government's even threatened to use the law against a housing development in Ontario. So this was not actually just about pipelines, and certainly not about large infrastructure that crosses the country. It was a real aggressive move to challenge the sovereignty of provinces to regulate the industry and development within their own provinces. And I think that's why the Supreme Court came down pretty hard on the federal government and said, well, hang on, no, this is not your role. You have a role to play when the federal government is affected, when things are crossing provincial borders. But inside a province, that's the job of the province to regulate. And I think that's why we saw the ruling go the way it did.
Dan, why would the federal government even attempt something like this, which seems so clearly a violation of provincial jurisdiction?
Well, I think it's hubris, political hubris. They have the support of the New Democrats, the Greens, the Bloc. Well, to a less extent when it involves provincial rights. I think the Bloc really clued into what this was all about. Its provincial government in Quebec certainly understood that. The Legault government, from my understanding, was a partial signatory, or at least took an amicus approach in support of the opposition to the bill. But that aside, I think what it really demonstrated, perhaps more than anything else, is that the federal government believed that when it came to the much larger issue of net zero climate, it could pretty much do what it wanted Of course, when you had a previous Supreme Court decision that basically allowed the use of good governance, peace, order, and government